Thank you so much for joining us for a webinar today about the midterm results and their impact on Pet Partners advocacy. I'm delighted to be joined with some really phenomenal panelists today, and we'll kick things off by allowing everyone to introduce themselves. Mike, would you like to get us started?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Mike Fober. I'm the president of the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council. We are a legislative and regulatory membership organization that represents everybody in the companion animal care community. Whether you bring an animal into the world, help people bring it into their home, or help care for it, we work on issues related to you. And we're very happy to be sort of Pet Partners allies and sort of extra set of hands on the ground in Washington, D.C. For things like Pet Night on Capitol Hill and other events. We always enjoy working with you guys.
Thanks, Mike. Natasha, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I'm Natasha Rankin. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the American Counseling Association, which is headquartered in Alexandria, but we represent counselors and those interested in counseling and the services they provide all across the world. And my background and the work that I do here involves advocacy and engagement programs. And as we are in the mental health space, we're very proud of the work that Pet Partners does and the Therapy Animal Program, and looking forward to connecting with everyone here on expanding your advocacy and becoming champions.
Thank you, Natasha. Kathy, we're glad to have you here today as well.
Hi, Kathy Mitchell. Thanks for inviting me to be on the panel today. I'm with PetSmart, which many of you probably have been into a PetSmart store. We're in all 50 states and in Puerto Rico and Canada. I am responsible for the government affairs portfolio, meaning that I manage the legislative and advocacy portfolio for PetSmart for all 50 states, Canada, Puerto Rico, and and the federal government. So trying to look out for, PetSmart, making sure that, consumers have access to animals that we sell in stores, that we have access to adoptions of animals, in our store and outside of our store, and then making sure that our products that we sell are good for you and for your pets.
Excellent. And I'm also joined today by Brandon Fuller. Brandon, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Brandon, and I'm the owner of Raise the Roots, and we are assisting Pet Partners in building out their grassroots advocacy work and continuing to engage all of our grassroots advocates in trying to improve the access to the human-animal bond through legislation.
And of course, I'm delighted to be the host for today. My name is Mary Margaret Callahan. I'm the Chief Mission Officer for Pet Partners. I have been working here for 5 years, and I'm so excited to see the Pet Partners Grassroots Advocacy Program develop after just launching not long ago, a little more than a year ago. And so we've got some exciting things to talk about today. As I mentioned at the very kickoff of this webinar, if you have questions that come up during the course of the webinar, you'd like to ask any of our panelists, you can certainly type those into the question box off of your dashboard, and I will have those and try and find the right place to work them into our conversation this evening. So let's go ahead and we'll get started with looking at 2018 in review.
Hey, so thank you, Mary Margaret. This is Brandon. And as Mary Margaret just said, we did launch the advocacy program just about a year ago, and it's gone so well. We've had a really successful year in 2018. This year alone, we've recruited 3,541 new advocates. Those advocates have come from our base of Pet Partners volunteers, but it's also come from members of the public who really care about the human-animal bond and protecting it. And so we're excited to have all of those people and many of you who are on the webinar today as part of the advocacy program. Overall, we have 5,700 advocates who have taken 14,247 advocacy actions this year. So that includes emails to Congress, tweets to Congress, phone calls, just lots of outreach to Congress. And most of that action has been around two pieces of legislation. They're both called the PAWS Act. One is the Pet and Women's Safety Act, and one is called the Puppies Assisting Wounded Soldiers Act. The Pet and Women's Safety Act is aiming to protect pets in domestic violence situations where there's not a shelter available for a family trying to escape those situations that accepts pets. And so unfortunately, that means that pets are either harmed or sometimes partners who are the survivors of domestic violence stay in the home to protect the pets and experience more abuse. So the good news about the that version of the PAWS Act is that it was wrapped into the Senate Farm Bill, which has already passed in the Senate. The House passed a similar farm bill, but it did not include the PAWS Act. Right now, the Senate and the House are hashing out the differences between these two versions of the farm bill, and we are cautiously optimistic that what comes out of those negotiations will include the PAWS Act, and that the farm bill will be passed before the end of this Congress, which is obviously coming up now that we just had an election. The other version of the PAWS Act, the Puppies Assisting Wounded Soldiers, that is a pilot program to provide therapy animal or service animals to veterans who are suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And that bill has kind of stalled out. We'll see if it gains any momentum during the end of this session, but we'll continue to support it in the new Congress if it comes up again. So other than that, we've had a lot of success this year with some state work. So in Michigan, we were successful in stopping a bill that would have allowed anybody to pay to receive an obedience certificate for their pet, and then they would have been able to participate as a therapy animal team. And obviously that doesn't meet the standards of pet partners and isn't a comprehensive approach to therapy animals. And so we opposed that bill. We actually had a volunteer who spoke out against it, and we were successful in stopping it. And then Mary Margaret was part of a group in New York that was organized by the legislature in New York and led by the governor's team to explore different measures that should exist in New York around therapy animals and getting therapy animal handlers certified. So it's been a very busy year, and I think we've had a lot of success for being so new to this world, and I really thank everybody for being so active and taking action when they're asked to.
I couldn't agree more. It's been an exciting start, and we look forward to more activity in the coming year. Obviously, we're here to talk a bit about midterm results, so why don't you take us through some of the election results as a high-level summary?
Yeah, so we just thought we'd throw some numbers out there to kind of get a grasp around what did happen in the November elections and where things stand now. So the Republicans did expand their control in the U.S. Senate. They went from having a 52 to 48 seat advantage to a 53 to 47 seat advantage, so it's not a significant increase, but they did gain an additional seat. Democrats, I think as everybody knows, gained control of the U.S. House of Representatives. Republicans had a 39 seat advantage to the Democrats, and now the Democrats will have a 35 seat advantage to the Republicans in the House. Democrats flipped 7 governor seats in the states, and we saw what's called a trifecta, which is where one party controls both chambers of the legislature and the governor's mansion. That changed in 11 states. So now we have 14 Democratic trifectas and 22 Republican trifectas. Democrats at the state level, they had a net gain of 6 of these trifectas. Republicans lost 4, and 13 states are now slated to have divided government, which is 2 different parties controlling 2 different chambers of their legislature. The only state that is, let's see, we also saw Democrats have a net gain of 5 legislative chambers. And so now the chamber count is 62 Republican legislative chambers and 37 Democratic legislative chambers.
I think we can all agree, anybody who's participating on this webinar, it was certainly a lot of activity around the midterm results. And so, you know what's happened in your local level, at your state. We continue to watch some of these things on the federal level. So let's think ahead to 2019 to some extent. Now, the Pet Partners Advocacy Program strives to be responsive to things that are happening at the federal and at the state levels. So obviously, as Brandon alluded to, we're certainly watching how both those pause acts perform before the end of the year. Cautiously optimistic that the Pet and Women's Safety Act will pass as part of the Farm Bill, which we would consider a huge, exciting win. But in terms of the other pause act around service animals for soldiers, we're watching that to see if it gets reintroduced in 2019, which it certainly could, in which case we would certainly support that again going forward. The other thing that we're keeping a close eye on is the FAA reauthorization, which included some language in regards to guidelines and regulations for service animals and emotional support animals on airplanes. Now, while obviously Pet Partners' focus isn't service animals and emotional support animals, we know our bailiwick, if you will, is therapy animals. We did poll all of our advocates about how they felt about the FAA reauthorization and if they felt strongly about regulations for service and emotional support animals, particularly in regards to travel. And you certainly responded that you did. 70% of our respondents said that it was a topic that was extremely important to them. So what we're doing now is watching to see what guidelines the FAA comes out with so that then we can either support that and hopefully have that move forward, or if we think that there's an opportunity to improve the education and perhaps redirect some of that, we'll be doing that too. So right now we're in a bit of a wait and see when it comes to the reauthorization. There may be items that come up at the state level that are relevant for us to participate in. The one thing that we watch closely, and that I think most of you would agree there's a fair bit of conversation around, is what to do about the confusion around service animals, emotional support animals, therapy animals, how that potentially might be problematic in terms of abuse with intention to the ADA guidelines that are existing. And so at the state level, there's lots of conversations around that, and that's something that we'll keep an eye on. I did get a question from Jane, who's attending today. Thank you, Jane, for being my first question, who was asking, what are we doing in terms of helping to educate people about the definitions and the distinctions between therapy dogs, emotional support dogs, or emotional support animals, service animals, and the like. So it's a great question. We are going to look at doing some educational campaign pieces in 2019 to better explain the distinctions between those two. What we'd like in an ideal situation would be to partner with an organization that perhaps does something on a more formal level with service animals or ESAs, so that we could approach it as a coalition. We're thoughtful that a lot of this is, great relationship building, and we would love to be able to work with another entity to help in terms of that education. Certainly, we'll continue to do some educational work around the distinctions. And so I would just say to those of you attending today, if you're aware of conversations at the state level, if state level legislation does come up that you think would be relevant for this group, don't hesitate to contact us. We certainly do watch for that, but you may become aware of things that are sort of in process before they kind of get caught in the clipping service. So we're extremely interested in doing that, and we'll certainly get involved where it makes the most sense. So we've reviewed sort of what's happened in the midterms. So what does that mean for us now? How did these midterms results change things? So Mike, would you get us started on this topic, please?
Sure. We look at a number of things when we're considering what elections are likely to do in a given state. First of all, one of the things you want to look for is places where control has changed significantly. That can mean a change in party control. For example, Wisconsin, where the governorship has flipped. It can also mean change in the overall makeup of a body. For example, in New York State, Democrats now control supermajorities and are in a position to be able to not only override any gubernatorial vetoes, but also to ensure that if there's a piece of legislation that they want to pass, they will have the votes to be able to do so with or without the support of their Republican counterparts. Now, for an organization like Pet Partners, party control is probably less of the determinant to the impact of the elections on what you're doing, as is the number of completely new faces that have come into state legislatures across the country. And this was a banner year. There are many, many new people coming into elected office at the state and federal level, people who in some cases have never held elected office before, or who are coming into seats where we've had either champions or, unfortunately, from time to time, opponents who represent clean slates. And so I think the primary thing that these election results represent for Pet Partners and for all of you on the call is really an opportunity to introduce yourself, to share the materials that the Pet Partners team has worked up to help educate them, to kind of go back to the question that was asked earlier, and to really kind of treat this as an opportunity to I don't want to say make a new friend, but to possibly even recruit a new ally into the discussion about what it means to truly support therapy animal programs. That's kind of the big picture version of it, and I'm sure that the other panelists have some thoughts as well. Without getting too far into the weeds, unless there are some specific questions, I'd kind of like to hear what other people have to say as well.
This is Natasha, and what I'd offer in following up on that is around the education is that's a key component ultimately to any sort of engagement, is seeing yourself as that opportunity when you have those new people who they don't yet necessarily have those go-to resources. They're not exactly sure to whom they can turn when a subject area comes up where they don't have the resources yet. They don't have the knowledge. And so positioning yourself as if not an expert, somebody who's definitely engaged, aware, and can create a connection, it's a great opportunity as we move forward and talk a little bit more about some of the engagement strategies. It is a definite opening with the transition that we've seen with the last election.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So let me.
And actually, if I can.
Oh, please go
just
ahead.
really quickly, if I can put a number on it, 1,700 new legislators have come into office across the country. Literally 1 in every 4 elected officials at the state or federal level is brand new.
That's amazing. I mean, a huge number, and to both of your points. A great opportunity for us. So allow me to say something that maybe nobody's asking. For people who haven't done a lot of advocacy work before, or maybe their advocacy work has been primarily sending emails or tweets or social media action, is it reasonable for our advocates to be perceived by new legislators as potential resources or experts in the human-animal bond?
I think it's reasonable. I think the trick is to establish that relationship in a way that doesn't come across as transactional right out of the gate. The last thing you want to do is go to someone and say, I'm an expert, you need to listen to me, especially if you're going in to oppose something that they're working on. Instead, the preferred approach is to kind of build a relationship step by step. To begin by attending an event where the newly elected representative or legislator is going to be present, to introduce yourself to them, but also to introduce yourself to their staff. Because one of the key ways to ingratiate yourself to an office isn't to insist on always having to talk to the boss so to speak, but rather to know who the staffers are that are working on your issue set, and to get to know them, to kind of provide for them resources when they're needed, but also to make it clear to them that that you're there with the goal of helping. That you're not there looking to get something out of them per se, but rather to make sure that that you can help them understand an issue that you've got some particular background and expertise in.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion, Mike. And I think one of the things that people who are on this call who are trying to figure out how could they be more involved in state level advocacy and state level, what's happening at the state level in terms of the legislature, is to find out who your members are of the state House, state Senate, state Assembly. Sign up for their email newsletter, find out when they're going to have events, if they're going to have a town hall meeting that maybe you could attend in your community. You could go to those kind of events, introduce yourself. If you have a card, share that with them. Email anybody who's on the newsletter that's listing themselves as staff, and just casually introduce yourself, explain what a therapy animal team is, and if they ever have any questions about something that comes up related to human-animal or human-assisted interactions, that you'd be happy to answer those questions and be a resource for them. But I think it's really useful. Follow them on social media, sign up for their email newsletter, and just start to get to know them a little bit and see what issues are important to them and what issues they're working on.
Great advice, and particularly relevant given that right now we're sort of watching to see what happens in 2019. So it's a chance to sort of be ahead of the curve a little bit, sounds like. Well, let's take this sort of to the sort of our next question, which is, we've had lots of changes, an unbelievable number of new legislators and representatives across the country. So what impact do all these potential changes have for human-animal bond organizations like Pet Partners or other organizations, as well as when we think about the ability for people to access the human-animal bond through different activities, whether that's things like the Pet and Women's Safety Act or the Puppies and Wounded Service Peoples Act, and what should we be aware of? Kathy, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think that, and this was kind of touched on a bit ago, but we're very fortunate in the pet world and the pet industry when we're working with animals, in that it's not necessarily a partisan issue. So there are senators and congressmen, male, female, Republicans, Democrats, from large cities, from rural areas. The animals are loved across the board. And so I think it's a great opportunity for an organization like Pet Partners and others within the pet industry to really build upon those relationships and explain. And I think most people have some sort of semblance of what the human-animal bond is, whether they know exactly that it's called that or not may not be the case. But when I walk into a congressional office at the federal level or to a state legislator's office, rarely do people not tell me about their dogs or their cats or their ferrets or their pet snake. They all want to show pictures. They all want to connect with you and show you and tell you about how great that animal is in their life. And so there's such an opportunity for us to capitalize on that if we're just getting in those offices and building those relationships, whether it's, like was mentioned before, through town hall meetings, through individual meetings, with city councilors, with state legislators, with members of Congress, both in DC and back at home. There's just so many opportunities. And I think that we're in an industry and we're advocating for a cause that really transcends a lot of the bipartisan stuff that we hear about in the news. And so this is an opportunity, particularly at the federal level, when you have a Democratic Congress and a Republican Senate, bipartisan initiatives are being sought after. So this is something that they can reach across the aisle and do something together. And so I see opportunities for the PAWS Act for both of them, moving forward, just continue to build on the base that we have and continue to beat that drum of what the human-animal bond is and how important it is to organizations like Pet Partners, companies like PetSmart, organizations like PJAC. All of us are in this together, and I think there's a way to really beat that drum continuously across the country as these legislators come into office.
I mean, it's a great point, and maybe one that feels almost relieving in some ways to think that this is a real opportunity to come in where partisan politics doesn't really play a part, because most people are huge fans of pets on some level or another, and so certainly that does give us an advantage, I'd say. Does anybody else have any other thoughts about how the new representatives might impact change in terms of human animal bond organizations?
Well, this is Brandon. I think we now have two states that we know have shown an interest in legislating around this issue, specifically around therapy animals. And so in Michigan and New York this year, it popped up. And on one hand, it was great what was happening in New York. They were looking for organizations like ours to provide our experience and our expertise to help shape really smart legislation. Whereas in the Michigan example, it was one particular member of their legislature who had gone and pursued legislation really without speaking to organizations like Pet Partners about what negative impact that could have on these interactions. And so my kind of takeaway from that, given that I don't think we've seen a lot of direct therapy animal kind of legislative efforts in the states before, is that there does seem to be an interest in this area. And I think in general, related to service animals and emotional support animals and then therapy animals, that there is some confusion about what distinguishes each type. And there's a lot in the news right now about different scenarios involving animals in public spaces. And so I think we may see a continuation of bills popping up and policies popping up, and it's, we kind of have to figure out when we can respond, like in New York, where we can have an opportunity to help guide that process, and then in situations like Michigan, where we can push back against something that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I do think here that there is going to be a continuation of interest in the animal area in public spaces, and I think our job is to educate these legislators about the things that distinguish therapy animals from some of these other types of animals and interactions that are out there. I think that would serve us well, so that we don't end up finding out that a piece of legislation has been filed that directly impacts therapy animals, and we're not really the type of animal that they actually are trying to target.
Yeah, a great point. A great point. Well, I've had a couple questions come in that are relevant, so we'll pause for a second to address those. So trying to combine and perhaps paraphrase these, there's some question about what's possible to do in terms of educating new advocates, people who haven't done this before, best ways to start a conversation, things like that. And we are going to talk to this a little bit towards the end, but yes, Pet Partners is preparing a variety of resources to help you get started, to get place started. Obviously, the easiest place to get started when we do have action alerts is to look at those templated emails or tweets and sort of go off of those. But for those of you who are interested in face-to-face meetings, starting to interact directly with your legislatures at a state level or even at a local level, someone did comment that there's local government, city and municipal, that might have relevant things too. All strategies that we can use in order to build those relationships. And in fact, that's what we're going to be talking about next. So it's like it was meant to be. So we know we've got all sorts of new representatives. What are the best ways to build those relationships? How do we educate those people so that they do know the difference between therapy animals, emotional support animals, and service animals? Natasha, you've got some expertise in terms of strategies around this. What are your top tips for our advocates?
One of the things that I think is so important is to demystify and take away some of the fear, if you want to say, about being an advocate. You don't need to be an expert. You can just have passion. And when you start with education, and when you start with that as really what the key of being an advocate is all about, is it's really about being a go-to resource and an educator on on this issue and on any issue really. And when we look at it, and what we have brought and what we recommend is looking at four key points, which is about knowing your community, knowing your legislator, being personal and authentic, and then being creative. And I think that Mike, Kathy, and Brandon have each spoken to different parts of this. And so, if you're starting with community, it's really understanding that that's one of the greatest strengths of being an advocate, is knowing knowing where to go, where you can, where you're able to seek out other people who share the same passion that you do. And so knowing what other nonprofits are local to you that might also be engaged in the passion of therapy animals, and of looking at the human animal bond, if you're looking at mental health providers, hospitals, other places, that other organizations that are going to share some of your passion. That's a great way of looking at building some strength in numbers, because I think we all feel that we're in a much more supportive environment when we're surrounded by others who are able to support our efforts, and we can provide support to them. So looking locally, it's a great place. It's a great place to start, is to really know your community. To the point I think we brought up about knowing your legislator, I cannot stress enough the idea that it's not just the legislator or the member that you're looking to speak and engage with. The staffers are, whether they're on the Hill in DC or they are local in your district office, they are the knowledge source. They are who the member turns to when they're looking for information, and having that connection, knowing them knowing you and you knowing them, is a real advantage and a great way of establishing that relationship and going, I think as somebody had mentioned earlier, moving beyond transactional, really forming that relationship. When you're thinking about some of the tactics, is with all of these new members coming in, and understanding what his own passions are, what areas of what issues are of concern. You can find that information out very easily at house.gov or senate.gov on the federal level, and almost every state at this point, with the ability to find information on the web is fabulous. Being able to follow them on Twitter, being able to follow them on Facebook. I think a lot of them have Instagram as well, and that's a great, you think about the ability to communicate with visual, with pictures. It's another great way of keeping up to date and getting a sense of who your member is. I believe we've mentioned also the whole idea of town halls. When the key of when you think about knowing your member is that when they're local, when you have them, when they're back in the district, they're back in the state, they're holding a town hall, they're at community events, they're much more accessible. And it's really amazing. What we've found is that the connections that advocates make on the local level are really some of the strongest ones out there, because they know them from the community. They come to expect seeing them at different events, and it really is a great way of establishing that relationship. And when you do have some of the tips around, as you move into actually creating the relationship, creating the connection, and establishing yourself as someone they can turn to for information or education. You might not have the information, but you're able to get them to it. Is to remember that as you're advocating for all the wonderful resources that are available when you're looking from pet partners, is to remember that they're really looking for your story. They're looking for the impact that you make, your own personal narrative, and that's they're much more interested in hearing from you than they are from a lobbyist. And so ultimately, that being personal, being authentic, and knowing your legislator is going to be really is really going to make the difference between being seen as someone who is can be a champion and an advocate versus somebody who's just looking to get something from one of the members or from the staffers. And when we think about creativity and thinking about, you think about, your community, you get to know your member, your legislator, those staffers that work very closely with them. You bring a personal story, a great narrative to a conversation. You can start to get creative. Some of the things that I've seen work amazingly well, and I could see bringing to the work here is looking for local events and ways of, at community days or at fairs or festivals or in alignment with like a recognition day of looking for tying into those events, some creative ways of raising awareness of the therapy animals and therapy animal programs. And one idea, I actually was sharing this, I was sharing some of this earlier with some of my team members who were getting really excited. They're very passionate people, and they were talking about how if they were doing this, how they would use, there's a happy hour that's held for animals, primarily for dogs in Old Town Alexandria during the warm months. And they were talking about how they could use that type of event to both seek out other people who might be interested and engaged in this area, but of also how they might be able to invite some of the local leaders in to both meet people and to hear the different issue areas in a way that was outside of a campaign event, was really could be seen as a community and as a fun event. So it is the key really does start with knowing your community, getting to know and forming a relationship with your legislator, being authentic and personal in the stories that you tell when you are sharing information. And ultimately it does lead to some creative ways of being an advocate without thinking that it has to be that advocate has to mean going into an office and sharing, a file folder or a folder of information.
Those are all such well taken points. And I just kept thinking while you were speaking that for any of our advocates who have experience as a therapy animal volunteer, there are a wealth of stories and lots of unbelievably moving and powerful stories. And it's a great opportunity to engage with people. And one of our comments came from our audience members who also reaching out to local clubs, visiting your Rotary, going to the Kiwanis, making a presentation, helping to educate and get to know just community members in addition, much to Natasha's initial point. So it's fantastic.
Mary Margaret, if I could share on that, I actually used to be the executive director of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And if I can just follow up on it, I think it's why I started with community is so very frequently we think about ourselves as kind of standalones, and there are so many other organizations that they're looking for alignment. They're looking for ways of joining forces. And when you stop and take a look at, whether it's Rotary, whether it's GFWC, Seroptimus, Optimist, there's so many other service club organizations out there, as well as the nonprofits. I think when you sit down and you take a look at who already is out there that is automatically or would be a natural alignment with the therapy animal volunteers and the therapy animal programs, they're probably already out there waiting to be contacted.
It's a great point. Does anyone else have any comments, suggestions, ideas, examples of good relationship building that we could share with our audience today?
Well, I would say to our audience to be expecting some new outreach from Pet Partners in the upcoming year, opportunities to share educational resources with all of these new legislators, an opportunity to email them some facts about therapy animals and the work that we do. This is a great opportunity to get in there and educate them and show that Pet Partners is a great resource for any questions that they have about these kinds of issues. So we will be counting on all of you to be sending those emails and educating your legislators. But I also think we should, if you're interested in perhaps inviting a state legislator or a local official or even a member of Congress to one of your interactions, to meet one of your clients, to an event that you attend, in order to show them what these interactions are like and how vitally important they are to the people that we serve. Yeah, I encourage you to reach out to us, to Mary Margaret, and we would be happy to help you make those arrangements.
Absolutely. We don't ever want you to feel like you're going alone. And that's one of the things that we'll do. We are working, as Brandon talked about, on a variety of new resources of opportunities to help you reach out to people. And if you're interested in taking an additional step and maybe doing some in-person visits and things, let us know. We are here as a resource and excited to help you. Well, we've covered most of our topics from our agenda. We've got a little bit of time around answering any questions, and I'd love to give each of our panelists an opportunity to share sort of a final thought, whether for you it is what you think is the best takeaway, if it's something you think our advocates should consider, if it's an opportunity that you think we have, and just sort of summarize your final thought, and then we'll see if any questions come through before the end. And otherwise, I want to be really respectful of everyone's time, and we may finish 10 minutes early or so. So who would like to start? I feel like a school teacher. Who would like to begin and give us a final thought before we go of our panelists?
This is Kathy. I can give a quick final thought. I think, in the infancy of the Pet Partners Advocacy Program, last year, a lot of the interactions were made via email and maybe even phone calls and some visits. But I would just challenge each of you to kind of step outside of your comfort zone and get to that face-to-face relationship stage where you're visiting with staff and with legislators. It can be intimidating at first, so just know that the first couple of times you might be nervous. There's no reason to be, and you'll realize that over time, but you still might be nervous that first couple of times. So you go with someone else, go with a partner, go with someone in your community who can be there with you, and you can go through that together. But I just really challenge you to get outside of the email and phone calls and really build those relationships with your policymakers, because it will definitely pay off as we begin to educate them.
I think it's a really great insight. And I think what we saw happen in Michigan, just by example, where somebody just happened to, it was a therapy animal team who had a particular expertise in this area, and they reached out to their local state representative, who was the one leading the charge in that legislation. And the team, or the office, was really open to having a conversation and actually just having that chat and just exploring that particular topic. They also were asked to lend some expertise to other issues that the legislature was working on. And I think having that, just kind of overcoming that little bit of fear, because I do know it can be intimidating to build these relationships. These people, they're human just like us. And just because they've been elected to a public office doesn't mean that they are incapable of having a conversation and learning something new. And I think that actually most of these people are really looking to build relationships with the community and learn more about the work that you do and the things that you're passionate about. So I encourage, again, everyone to follow their elected leaders on social media and on their email newsletter, to look for opportunities to interact with them and to become a resource for them and build that relationship.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, one of the things that I would just kind of tack on at the end of that, because everything that's been said so far is spot on, is to not underestimate the power of the attraction that your therapy, that your role as a handler of a therapy dog has for the people who you're interacting with there. These are, especially staffers, are generally younger people. They are by and large, a very pet-friendly community, and they're going to be drawn to your animals in the way that they're drawn to pets. And that's a real opportunity for you to educate them on the difference between a pet and a therapy animal, but also to do it in a way that draws them in further. Interaction opportunities like the ones that we've done in Washington and elsewhere really go a long way toward fixing in people's minds exactly what it means to have a therapy dog working. They get a much better understanding for what we mean when we say that the dog is working than if they were to simply read about it or see a flyer. So really do not underestimate the possibilities and the power of those in-person interactions.
And the last part I would add for myself is to remember to seek out others, in that you aren't, in many ways, you're not just an advocate when it comes to the work that you're doing with the legislators or the other community leaders. Part of it is around gaining awareness on the community level and gaining other advocates, being able to add others to the mission and to your efforts. I think we spoke about the idea of strength in numbers and not feeling alone, and there is nothing better than knowing that there are other organizations and other people who share the same passion, share in the mission, and can be called upon when all of these opportunities come around.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for your final thoughts. We do have a couple questions and comments that have come in from our audience. Two that kind of combine, that I think I combine is, someone commented, I think, Natasha, to one of your comments, they said, you said there were organizations waiting to be contacted. What kind of organizations do we want to have as allies for this, for any kind of shared work or collaborative work? And ultimately, I think, to me at least, it's people with a piece of a shared mission, right? So whether that's a mental health organization, I mean, we're so fortunate to have Natasha from the ACA here with us today, or people who feel passionately about animal welfare. There could be a wide variety, and I think this is where knowing your community really comes into play. Similar comment in terms of figuring out and knowing what your legislatures cares about. What does your representative feel strongly about? I think about how many bios I read of people all over the place, where they talk about, their professional aspirations and the work they do, and then they go on to mention their pets. There's all sorts of opportunities, I think, to Mike's point as we were talking our final thoughts, that people are drawn to therapy animals, to pets in general, to the human-animal bond, even if they don't know that's what they're calling it. And I think we've got a lot of great opportunities to make connections on that level. Really so very fortunate to have such fabulous panelists joining us today. This webinar was recorded. I will be sending out a copy or a link to the recording if there's anything you wanted to hear again or get more information on. I will just say, kind of finally, as we close, if you have more questions, more comments, you're wondering about something, you've heard about something in your state legislature that you want to bring to our attention because it might be an opportunity for us to mobilize our advocates around, you can always contact us at advocacy@petpartners.org. We're happy to hear from you, want to know what resources would be most advantageous, and if you have suggestions or ideas, that is the best place to direct them. I would love to thank Kathy, Mike, and Natasha, as well as Brandon, for joining us today for this wonderful webinar. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you found it useful, and we look forward to a wonderful 2019 and more opportunities to advocate for the human-animal bond.